One thing I learned a long time ago is that the field of psychology will pathologize just about anything. It's okay to want to come from a psychological perspective, from a scientific perspective, but it's not okay to pathologize everything that happens in human existence. Take, for example, any kind of medical condition that we may have that can really cross the line into a normal area of human discomfort. An example of that would be maybe shivering or having chills, right? It would feel kind of weird, I think, to most of us if we had chills because it's cold outside, and then we go to the doctor and say, for some reason I have chills, and the doctor says, what's the word for when you have chills? The bigger word.
Here is information from Word Hippo.
Horripilation. You have horripilation. Everything doesn't need to be pathologized. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about character pathology and possibly having a parent who really isn't sick in the first place and doesn't have a psychological problem, but rather just a whole set of inappropriate behaviors. But before we jump into that, let me briefly introduce myself in case you're new to my channel. My name is Tamara. I'm internationally and I'm board certified in trauma therapy. I'm licensed in mental health. I specialize in treating children, teens, and families, as well as adults who are dealing with trauma right in my private practice. Let's jump in. When I told one of my coworkers about the word horripilation, she looked at me and said, "What does that mean?" And I said to her, it means having the hair on your arm stand up. It means having chills. And she looked at me and she's like, that doesn't need to be a necessary word. Like, it is so unnecessary to call it horripilation. Why not just say chills, right? And a lot of people feel like her. There's no real reason why we have to pathologize everything that goes on. Yes, I believe in the sophistication of my field. Yes, I believe we have made some, terrific scientific advances in the world of medicine and science and heritability and all kind of other areas of specialty that I could list. But one of the things that I don't like is when we take all of these big labels and we apply it to behavior, we apply it to experience, because that's kind of how our mind works. When something happens to us, we have been so conditioned to label it, right? To give it a term, a medical term, to get onto Google and Google something, to try to align a person's behaviors to the behaviors that we have Google searched, and then we walk around with this label, calling that person the label, and it's probably completely wrong, right? I've also seen some people, primarily those who consult with me or who see me for psychotherapy, they come in and they label drop, and then they preface it by saying, I'm not a professional, but A, B, and C. And it's kind of like a way to erase their guilt or minimize, in a sense, their researching online. And, it's interesting to watch how label focused we are as a human society. For example, you have a mom who's very arrogant and narcissistic and cold and rude and arrogant. I think I already said that. And really just pompous and all about herself, right? She throws herself out there to intimidate people and to look powerful and to be beautiful and attractive and sexy, and the list goes on. Let's say that that's your mother, right? The first thing you're likely to do is go to Google, right? You're going to type in arrogance, haughtiness, pompousness. Google is going to show you a whole directory of articles on narcissism. That doesn't necessarily mean she's narcissistic. Narcissism has a set criteria, and that criteria is often found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I've talked a lot about it on my channel. Here's a picture of the front cover. And the diagnostic criteria isn't just a set of diagnoses that explains symptoms. It is literally a manual of symptoms and criteria that professionals, experienced professionals, must learn to differentiate, identify and correctly treat in order for it to become a medical condition. You can't just buy the DSM and be like, okay, that's me right there on page 56, because it may or may not be, right? With experience, with true knowledge, with real knowledge, and without the label being applied, you probably are going to meet a diagnostic criteria for something else. Not that I'm trying to minimize the sophistication of the DSM, but it errs, right? And you can't just look at the book and say, okay, this is me. You have to have somebody with a more objective perspective identify what the issue is and see if you meet all the criteria that's listed in the DSM before you can be diagnosed a narcissist. Let's say, for example, you have a father who is cold, mean, they're manipulative, right? He guilt trips. He's the father, the parent who blames you, who rejects you, right? There's regression when he doesn't get his way. He's very immature. The first thing you're likely to do is go to Google again, or Yahoo, or Internet Explorer, whatever you use, and you're going to type in all those behaviors and symptoms, and you're going to find sociopath in Google. Try it right now. I bet you that's what's going to come up. So then you're going to be referring to this parent, this father, as a sociopath, which kind of gives a label to the behaviors for you to identify it, but then it also says that something's wrong with him. I want to challenge you in this video a little bit. Does it have to mean that there's anything specifically wrong with your father because he has all of those characteristics? Here they are on the screen, right? Your father has all these characteristics, but does it really mean that he is a sociopath? Does that really mean that he's a narcissist? It would make understanding this person easier, right? It would make identifying these behaviors a breath of fresh air for you, because it's a label, because it's something that you can identify with. But does that actually mean that he is what Google and Yahoo and Internet Explorer tell you that he is? No, not at all. We pathologize things to help us understand and categorize the things that are hard to understand and categorize. But have you just thought that maybe, just maybe, this is genetic, this is how they were born, and this is how they were constructed over time. This is how they were raised, this is how they were taught to think of themselves, and this is what they've decided to become. Have you ever paused and thought about that? It's important to understand that there are simply some people who are just born this way, and it doesn't have to be a label. It doesn't mean that the abusive mother that you've had all your life is a sociopath. It could just mean that she is arrogant, she's pompous, she's self-centered, she was raised to believe that hitting is the best way to raise a child. She was kind of abused herself growing up, so she learned that if she puts fear in you, that's the only way to get you to listen. That's the only way to stay on top of you, right? Because you're intimidated at that point. She has learned to make these behaviors instrumental, meaning that they are tools for her to use against you. Let me also clarify that I'm not saying that here's a pass for these kind of individuals, right? Here's a pass for these kind of parents. I am saying that sometimes when we label our family members, when we label the abusive parents that we've had growing up, I'm saying we to be inclusive, that is really sometimes a pass for them, right? Because you're saying, here's the problem, and they meet all of these different criteria. And so therefore, that is why my mother was very abusive and a substance abusing, dominating, controlling devil, for lack of a clinical term, all my life. If you take all that clinical language out of there and just say she's a devil, okay, this is how she behaves, you know, we might be onto something there. So what do we call these behaviors then if it's not a part of the diagnostic and statistical manual, this thing right here? And what do we call this parent who's behaving this way but may not meet diagnostic criteria to be a narcissist, to be a sociopath, to be someone with borderline personality disorder who's very angry and impulsive, right? So what do we say? Well, let's look at the fact that there are some parents and family members who have an inflated sense of self. They are arrogant, to the core. They believe what they have been told and fed about themselves. They may not have anything to show for their inflated sense of self, but it is something that they have learned to either take on because other people in their life has been inflated and arrogant and possessive and dominating and competitive and feeling like they are better than everyone, right? So maybe somebody modeled that behavior and now your parent is exhibiting that inflated sense of self. That's an example. Another example could be maybe this particular parent feels inadequate and doesn't feel like they measure up in society, that they are on a lower socioeconomic level, that they don't have the abilities and the intelligence and the wherewithal to be a part of a higher socioeconomic status group. So what do? Well, they throw themselves out there. They treat you poorly. They harm you. They hurt you because that makes them feel like they are important, right? And that builds that inflated sense of self. They have absolutely no respect for you or anybody else. Doesn't mean they're narcissistic. Doesn't mean that they're a sociopath and they meet that diagnostic criteria, but they definitely have a lack of respect for you and everybody else. They also could have distorted thinking. Maybe their distorted thought patterns is what causes the arrogance, the anger, the lack of respect for themselves and other people, right? That distorted image of themselves and other people and of the world can cause those behaviors that I just discussed a couple minutes ago. It doesn't necessarily have to mean they're a narcissist. It doesn't have to necessarily mean that they have a childhood that was traumatic and now they're these adults with these diagnostic labels. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. They could simply have a distorted way that they view themselves, you, and their life. They have poor self-awareness. When you don't know who you are or you have rejected who you are and you want to be somebody else, it's really hard for you to treat your own children well. It's really hard for you to connect in relationships, to be loving and compassionate and respectful, right? We also have what we can call recycled tactics, meaning that maybe your parent has learned that being dominant and bossing and controlling actually works, and they've kind of ingested or digested, this idea that if they are dominating and controlling and mean and scary and intimidating, that they can actually get their way most of the time, right? So they kind of recycle those tactics and they do it even with their children, and it's unhealthy and unnecessary. You also want to think of the fact that sometimes, people who are challenging or difficult, or they have a character pathology, meaning that they have some issues with their character and who they have become as a person. These individuals are not always defensive, but they're offensive, okay? They play the offense part. Let's think of football, for example. Instead of being the defense, they are the offense, right? And so people who are like this are constantly in the mode of fighting and competing and getting ahead and being defensive. And so maybe that's just the character of your parent. It doesn't necessarily mean they're narcissistic. This could just be who they are. This is what is wrong with who they have become over time. It's in their heart, it's in their mind, and it's in their soul. It doesn't have to be a label. Failing to accept reality. There are some parents who just simply are not in reality. And these kind of parents can become very dominating, arrogant, rude, disrespectful, narcissistic. But it doesn't mean, again, that they meet that diagnostic criteria for the label. They may go to a therapist and the therapist is like, I don't see anything I could diagnose and treat here. You also want to think of parents who tend to be very religious, right? Sometimes religiosity could be at such a heightened level that it feels like a diagnosis, and it's not. It's just they tend to be so religious and so wrapped up in their religion that they come across as somebody who has a problem. But religion can often tarnish a character depending on, how much religiosity that person is taking in, right? Whether it's a healthy religious group or not, whether they really understand humility and giving and generosity and kindness or not. And you also want to consider things like divorce and, having a miscarriage or not getting what that parent wants in life, not having healthy relationships because they're controlling. All of those things can be indicators that there's something wrong with the parent's character. It has nothing to do with the diagnostic label. You also may want to look at misplaced anger as well and displacement. Maybe they're an angry kind of a parent and they're angry for a bunch of reasons, right? But they decided to turn on you, to treat you wrong, to hurt you, to harm you. Doesn't mean that they should be at a therapist's office, and it doesn't mean that therapist is going to find anything either, but it still doesn't minimize that they have a character pathology, that there's something going on in their heart, their mind, and their soul. Right? So you want to be able to identify that's not a diagnostic label, that's not a sick person, that's not an individual with mental illness or mental health concerns, that's a person who's arrogant, has internalized arrogance, has absolutely no self-concept, is rude and inconsiderate, and maybe has been pushed along in life to a place of success, and now you can't tell them anything, right? Sometimes it's just that simple, and it makes it a little easier for everybody to understand what's really going on. I encourage you to check this video out right here if you want to learn a little bit more about character pathology. And here's a live chat that I did on Friday on this same subject. Thank you so much for being with me in today's video, guys. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and that bell button if you want to get more videos like this. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.